Zimbabwe's Finance Minister Patrick Chinamasa on Thursday presented the 2018 budget for the new government. Now, the budget included a raft of business and investor-friendly proposals, as well as plans to tackle corruption and waste. Presenting a $5 billion budget and a statement in Parliament under the new economic order, Chinamasa said the economy was struggling, as shown by low production and export levels, as well as high level of unemployment and a continuing deterioration in macroeconomic stability. The minister then came up with a series of reforms, austerity measures, which he said could lead to a 4.5% growth in 2018. He said the government will adopt a major policy shift to re-engage with the international community, the international financial institutions, and to attract investors.
At least this budget was presented with a new guard in town. We didn't have to have the Minister of Finance saying President Robert Mugabe. That in itself is very refreshing and very encouraging.
Although it is anticipated that it will be reduced, but in my opinion, as a starting point, we should have tried, or the minister should have tried, to have the government to live within its means, so that you resort to cash budget.
Most of the ministers used to travel in first class, most of the executives used to travel in first class, but we have now been relegated to the business class, which I think is a major reduction on expenditure.
Now, joining me in studio to analyze the Zimbabwe budget 2018 post-Mugabe is Tafadzwa Muguti. He's a founder, Group Chief Executive Officer of Africa City Holdings. And of course, you're at home. Are always welcome to join the conversation. Our Twitter handle at ANN7TV and all our social media platforms. Tafadzwa, very good evening to you. Thank you for coming to Africa Tonight.
Good evening to you too.
Great. So the whole world, and I suppose most importantly investors, are looking to see what a post-Mugabe budget will look like. There were very bold statements that were mentioned by the Finance Minister Chinamasa. Yes. And I think the one that stands out the most is the one about the indigenization law. He seems to have relaxed himself there. Mm-hmm. What are the major takeaways that stood out for you?
Well, I think first and foremost, everyone has been anticipating that this budget is going to be a game changer for Zimbabwe. And I think what it comes down to is the implementation from here on. Systematically looking, you'd find that the minister is simply saying, we are not going to spend what we don't have. So if you look at the situation where, as opposed to last year, they were almost spending about 50%, 60% of money that they did not have. So as a result, we had a huge budget deficit in Zimbabwe. Now, looking at it from this angle, I think we're looking at a country which realizes that there's need for foreign direct investment. We're looking at a country which realizes that it's time for reforms to be put in place. So if investors are looking at Zimbabwe right now, one of the things they want to look for is stability, consistency, and obviously policies shouldn't be seesaw. In the previous government, we've seen that policies come out today which are favoring, logically, yes, they're favoring the Zimbabwean people, but on a technical basis, they're not favoring the international investment community. Right. And I think that's been the outcry so far.
Well, some have argued that democratic reforms in Zimbabwe are very important. And as the international world is looking in, they want to see that this whole authoritarian rule that has been associated with Zimbabwe, things to do with free and fair elections, abuse of human rights is all going to change going forward. Do you think that this was put into consideration?
I think it was put into consideration, in my view. I know many people tend to differ. But I think what's very important is that if this government is going to succeed, they don't have to have a selective process. I think the world is watching. The president, Mnangagwa, is a very hardline president. And we're very expectant to some of the reforms he's going to bring in. But if you look at the situation we have right now, I think people have been very excited that they're finally tackling corruption. But it's being tackled in certain sectors. Right. So I like the fact that he's come across and said there's amnesty. People were basically putting money out of the country for various reasons. The economy could not sustain you to have your money inland. But however, now he's given this 3-month reprieve. And to many people who have done it, they should bring back the money. But I think what investors are looking for as well is to say there's so many people who have been benefiting from the downturns of Zimbabwe. How then is he going to turn it around? Right. And I think it comes down to implementation. I think the opposition right now has been saying it since morning to say it comes down to implementation. The question is, the government that is in Zimbabwe right now, is it able to then instill that confidence to say all of a sudden, when it comes to indigenization, we're going to prioritize creating jobs first, rather than just a few being empowered.
Exactly. I mean, there's talk of the 2.2 million jobs that were promised. That didn't quite pan out, did it? But anyway, going forward, I mean, you're an entrepreneur and you know how important it is for an economy to thrive. There has to be a strong infrastructure. You have to have decent roads, you know, railway lines that actually work. Electricity, we do know that ZESA had been struggling here and there, you know, to have businesses that are up and running. Do you think that was addressed appropriately going forward?
I think clearly looking, we're seeing a situation where there's a government which realizes that we've been overspending over this all these years. And I think the cuts which have been put in have been necessary. From the layman's point of view, yes, they can see that ministers are now going to have one car each. Those are cosmetic changes. The real changes are going to come when we start addressing state-owned enterprises which for the last 3 decades have not been generating any profit. They're gobbling up the big chunk of the budget year in, year out. They don't publish their results and so forth. And I think if Zimbabwe is really going to go further, we're looking at a situation where they need to stand by what they promise. Their word needs to mean something.
There needs to be accountability.
There needs to be accountability.
For those that are doing wrong.
There needs to be accountability. I clearly agree with you. If there's no accountability, then we're going to have a problem. But accountability doesn't start only at maybe at party level or even at the president himself. It starts with every single Zimbabwean. Right now, people, they call it burning money. People are exchanging foreign currency on the streets. They're doing everything which is against the monetary and the fiscal policies of the nation. So if there's accountability, it needs to come down right to every single Zimbabwean to know that this is a duty for us to be able to actually start changing the mindset. But you're also looking at a country whereby if a country goes into a negative stance for a very long time, people go into a situation where basically it's a dog-eat-dog situation. Everyone does what they think is best to put food on the table. Now, what the president is trying to do is to bring sanity. I'll give you a good example. In the last week or so, we've seen army and police going into the streets, removing the vendors. From the public, there's an outcry. These people are trying to earn a living. So whilst he's doing that, everyone is going to say, where are the jobs? So if they quickly don't start addressing that, you're going to have the same situation again, and then it becomes a running battle. And in the 7 months' time, the elections are going to be very interesting.
What do you make of the budget allocation, Tafaza? We saw the amount of money that was given to the military, the amount of money that was given you know, to the Ministry of Health, a lot of public outcry coming from people. I personally have had, you know, experience in Zimbabwean hospitals and the lack of medication, just basic necessities for, you know, people that are really in pain, people that are not well, that need immediate attention when it comes to their medication and not getting that. Do you think that was a fair allocation?
Look, there are two things I would have loved to see most besides defense and so forth. The first thing I would love to see is obviously a higher budget. Now, if I take you back to Zimbabwe of 25 years ago, even 20 or 15 years ago, the local clinic in a municipality, take Chitungwiza, take Bulawayo, they were so impressive. You could go into a municipality, a council clinic, get all the service that you need. Nowadays, they're giving out Panadols. So you've got a situation where I think, yes, it is right, but I think more could have been done in terms of the infrastructure, putting it across. But even if they have budget, you remember what I said about the mentality. The Zimbabwean healthcare sector needs to be more conscious that they're serving the people. As it is right now, you have doctors who are serving people in the public hospitals, but most of the times people are referred back to their private hospitals. So people like our grandmothers can then not afford that healthcare. I think some of the medical aids are not accepted in certain areas and so forth. So I think it's something which is a challenge. The second thing that I'm really concerned about is industrialization. You spoke about the 2 million jobs. And for me, I thought there needed to be more emphasis on the implementation of special economic zones. So special economic zones doesn't mean that we're going to have a Chinese company which comes in, builds a wonderful, nice looking like Dubai Trade Park in South Africa. No, we're looking at a situation where we identify communities, what industries are there, and the local communities become the special investment regions which feed into that. So we've seen in the past that even industrial areas, they will have manufacturing entities, but they import 100% of their raw materials, and yet some of them are actually available locally. So I think looking at it from that angle, they were supposed to put more emphasis on industrialization. Some of the policies right now are not favoring Zimbabweans. They're not protecting the local sector. Retail chains which have come from South Africa and elsewhere around the world are 100% importing everything you see on the shelf. So it needs to come to that stage where certain policies need to be done. So you can empower industry, but even if industry is not going to have customers, then you're going to have a problem. Those jobs need to be created. Once the government should focus on that, because that's where their tax then comes from. Yes. And then lastly, you spoke about accountability. For years, Zimbabweans have been paying this so-called NASA. up to now, I think I was paying it since I started working when I was 16, right? And many other Zimbabweans who have gone. There needs to be accountability. If you take people's tax money, we don't want to see a situation where you go back, and this is what investors are watching. Don't go back and say, oh, we have a deficit, or we overspent. If you did that, there needs to be an explanation. If you put money into Air Zimbabwe and they did not perform, heads should roll. That's where accountability comes in.
Very important. How long are you giving Zimbabwe? Should these, some of these sound policies be implemented properly for the economy to be up and running again, for us to see industries hitting the road running and to see some kind of change, any kind of change in Zimbabwe?
That's a very interesting question.
That's
It's a tough question. But what I can clearly say is that there are two sides to it. If Zimbabwe decides to entertain the right type of investor, I think they need to understand that they are this beautiful bride that everyone is looking at and saying there's intellectual capacity, there's technical capacity, there's resource capacity. But if they bring in investors who are just going to be looting, it's not going to help anything. And take caution on the Chinese investment model.
Right.
And I think many governments have been complaining and the people have been complaining. And I hear right now they've signed the 2 billion rand deal for the new parliament building. If the Chinese are bringing 3 Boeing 707s with the builders, the bricklayers, it's not going to help Zimbabweans. If the Chinese are bringing cement, iron ore, all those things, steel, sorry, from China is not going to help. We've got Zisco steel, we've got Lafarge, we've got every material they need to build is in Zimbabwe. So we'll start seeing jobs being created by infrastructure development projects. We start seeing industries actually benefiting from there. All of a sudden, if you're into protective clothing, if you're into construction material, if you're into leasing yellow machinery, you now have a market. That's the first thing. The second thing, which I think is very important, is that all the ministers who've been appointed need to be adjudicated based on performance. But it doesn't end there. It goes down to MPs. And I think... Legislation. So if MPs have been voted by people, they need to start being accountable for the economic transformation of their own constituencies.
Right, because that's where it starts before you get to national level.
So instead of you going and shouting at the president saying things are not working, you start at constituency level. What are you doing? How many jobs have you created as an MP? So if an MP cannot attract investors, the government can't attract investors because that's the legislation body.
From your lips to God's ears. Thank you so much. We certainly appreciate it. Tafadzwa Imguti, they're joining us in studio and sharing his pearls of wisdom with regards to the Zimbabwe budget that was recently pronounced by the Minister of Finance. Also, Tafadzwa Imguti is also the founder and Group Chief Executive Officer of Africa Per City Holdings.